Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Bill. Got everyone's attention. My name is Mark Baldessari, and I'm President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to the Bechtel Conference Center at PPIC for this important discussion about improving California's elections. This program is part of PPIC's 2013 Speaker Series on California's future. I'd like to thank the sponsors of this series for underwriting the support. They are Applied Materials Foundation, the California Endowment, the James Irvine Foundation, the Nicholas Berggruen Institute, Pacific Life Foundation, the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, Sierra Health Foundation, Southern California Edison Stewart Foundation, Union Bank, William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and knowledge partner McKinsey & Company. I'd like to also acknowledge that in the audience today are four of PPIC's board members. Maria Blanco, who is here, Steve Merksimer, Gary Hart, who is our board chair, Tom Sutton, who is also a board member, and thank you for joining us on behalf of PPIC. The series for the speaker series is also funded by PPIC's donor circle, and there are many people in this audience who have been part of that donor circle, and I thank you for your support. The event is an opportunity not only to highlight a very important topic in California's future, but for us to thank PPIC's many contributors and the foundations who support our work, many of whom are here today. I don't want to take the time to acknowledge everyone, but I do want to thank you all, and I want to especially thank the Bechtels, because without the Bechtels, we wouldn't be here today meeting in this room. So Stephen Bechtel and Lori Dox, thank you very much for your support. You get to see the wonderful use of the Bechtel Conference Center. If you were here last night, you'd see a different use of it, and the night before, and tomorrow, and the next day. So not just PPIC using this, and we encourage others who might be interested to find out about how you might use this wonderful center. The unrestricted gifts and grants that PPIC receives from so many of the donors who are here today help provide the flexibility for us to respond to many requests that we get from policymakers during the year, to take on timely projects, to put together events, to put together very unique products. Like when you're in our salon later on, take a look at the California 2025 Planning for the Future piece, which we've provided for policymakers as an example of the types of projects that we might otherwise be unable to pursue, as well as engaging with audiences not just here in San Francisco, but on a regular basis in Sacramento, and on occasion in Washington and throughout California. So on behalf of the Institute Board and staff, we'd like to thank all of those who support PPIC. Before we get started, two brief requests. There's an event survey on your chair. You know, PPIC is in the survey business, so we hope that you will fill out that survey and return it, because we want to get a good response rate tonight. And second, and I'm going to do it while I'm thinking about it, turn off your cell phone so that we're not interrupting the wonderful conversation that's about to take place. Now on to the program, and I'm really excited to have this program tonight, everybody who's participating in it here. First, we're going to hear from PPIC Research Fellow Eric McGhee, who will provide some context for today's discussion. He's going to talk about campaign finance and some of the issues surrounding the future of California's election. At the conclusion of his remarks, we're going to go right into a panel discussion that's going to be moderated by Scott Schaefer from KQED Radio. And Scott's voice is one that's very familiar around California through the California Report. And we're excited to have Scott here moderating the conversation tonight. And we will be featuring California Fair Political Practices Commission Chair Ann Ravel. And I'm really delighted that Ann could join us tonight. Really excited about the leadership and energy that she's brought to the FPPC chair role, and very, very pleased also to have California Chamber of Commerce President and CEO Allan Zaremberg, who's joined us from Sacramento today. And thank you, Allan, so much. You always bring so much wisdom and experience to these discussions, so we're really fortunate to have you here today. We will look forward to conversations from you, for questions from you following the conversation. You will be able to join in part of the conversation. That will be part of the program today. So with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, PPIC Research Fellow Eric McGhee, who will, his work focuses on elections, legislative behavior, political participation. And he's a real treasure to have at PPIC. Provides so much knowledge for us about the political context in California. And Eric, we look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to our distinguished guests. There are a lot of political reform issues that we could talk about when we speak of the future of California elections, but I thought I would focus in particularly for this intro on campaign finance. Campaign finance is something that I think is sort of near and dear to the hearts of both of our guests, and so it's somewhere that we can provide a little bit of context before going into the discussion, not to sort of take away from what else they might discuss. When people speak about campaign finance, I think they think first and foremost of the federal level and the rapid growth in money in politics in Washington, D.C. Also, I think people think of the Citizens United decision, which seemed like something of a capstone for that broader trend. And I think that those two developments, both the rise in money and this new sort of unlimited independent expenditure organizations, the super PACs that Citizens United has created, raise a broader set of issues. Is it a problem to have so much money in politics? Does it exacerbate inequality and corruption, or does it merely reflect the needs and demands of a complex economy? Do limits on campaign donations actually limit corruption and promote equality? Will clever people always find a way around these limits? And if limits make sense, how strict should they be? Is it a violation of free speech rights to force donors to reveal their identities? Even if it's okay to ask them to reveal their identities, can such transparency ever be truly effective? And should money even be considered speech at all? Since a Supreme Court decision in the late 1970s, money has been, at least to some extent, equated with speech, and so the First Amendment applies. Does that still make sense? When you talk about all these broader issues, people in California, I think, could legitimately say, what took you so long? California has been living with these challenges and controversies around campaign finance for years. In fact, in many respects, the Citizens United decision brought federal campaign finance law closer to what we practice here in the Golden State. Large amounts of money, for instance, have long been a staple of politics in California. We have the most expensive campaign finance system in the country by leaps and bounds. The question of whether to have limits is also relevant here and has been relevant here and has been part of the discussion. For many years, California had no real limits of any kind. It was sort of a wild west of campaign finance, at least no limits that stuck. Corporations and unions have always been allowed to give directly to candidates, something that's still forbidden at the federal level. Voters actually twice passed campaign finance limits in the 1990s, only to have them struck down by the courts because they were too strict. So it raises this issue of where do you set the limit? How strict can you make it? We've dealt with questions of effectiveness here, too. In 2000, voters passed Proposition 34, which finally imposed caps on direct donations to candidates that stuck and that last to today. But it really hasn't stopped the growth of money. The total money for statewide candidates, at least outside of gubernatorial candidates, has really hardly budged since Proposition 34. But it has grown an average of 12% per candidate per year for assembly races, and 26% for state senate races. Loopholes are also an issue here in California. After Proposition 34, it has spurred an active growth in independent expenditure committees. These are California's version of super PACs. We had them 10 years before the rest of the country. And this is where most of the growth has been in campaign finance, from basically zero in 2000 to almost 25% of all campaign money in legislative elections. And like at the federal level, all of these raise the same sorts of issues of equity. Is everyone represented equally? Does everybody have a seat at the table? But also transparency. Who is giving this money and what do they want? And effectiveness. Do caps even work? The debate about transparency, in fact, is very much happening. Last fall, and Ravel, through the FPPC, brought a lawsuit against the Americans for Responsible Leadership, an Arizona organization that put money into the No on Prop 30 campaign. She wanted them to disclose their donors under California campaign finance law. The FPPC won that suit, and when the Americans for Responsible Leadership revealed their donors, it turned out it was other organizations like Americans for Responsible Leadership. So it's turtles all the way down. In fact, this court case, the Americans for Responsible Leadership case, is just the latest way in which initiatives in California, something that doesn't exist at the federal level, have brought the issues of campaign finance into stark relief. Transparency, yes, for sure, but also the volume of money, the question of regulatory effectiveness, and in fact, just the basic wisdom of money as free speech. In fact, initiative money is treated almost as pure speech, with very little restrictions allowed. Transparency is about the only limit that you can really place on an initiative campaign. They can raise in unlimited amounts and spend it in unlimited amounts. And the growth of in initiative spending has outpaced every other form of campaign spending, averaged about 41% per initiative per year since 2002, 41% growth. So this raises all kinds of questions. How do you contain that spending without confronting the question of money as speech? Should you try and contain that money? Is the heavy spending on initiatives even a problem, or is it just the sign of a robust democracy? Overall, campaign finance is an important question of political reform, but we shouldn't separate it too much from other issues in the same domain. In many ways, the questions of campaign finance are the same questions that bedevil political regulation of any kind, and even democracy itself. Is the system fair? Does it give everyone a chance to participate? How do we ensure adequate representation when not everyone is paying attention and when some care more than others? How does one define a special interest? And how does one distinguish that from the public interest or the general interest? And how do you promote the legitimate state interest in equality and representativeness without going too far and stifling those same properties? So I'll kick it over to our wonderful guests today, and maybe they'll have answers for those questions and many more. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. Well, 2013 is a relatively quiet year as elections go in California. We did have some big and important, in some ways, local elections, such as the mayor's race in Los Angeles, but next year is going to be a big year. And of course, this being California, the big election is never that far away. The governor is up, all the constitutional officers. We're going to have a number of initiatives, no doubt, on the ballot. 3 have already qualified, and I think there's at least 5 that are 5 to 8 that are in the pipeline. And with that, of course, comes a lot of money to pass them or to block them from getting passed. And so today we're going to talk with 2 folks who are very much in the arena when it comes to politics in California. Let me just tell you a little bit about them. I think you know them, but immediately to my left, Ann Ravel is the chair, as Eric said, of the California Fair Political Practices Commission. She was appointed to that by Governor Jerry Brown in 2011. Before that, she served as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the U.S. Department of Justice. Most of her legal career was spent at the local level in Santa Clara County, including some 11 years as the top attorney in the county council office in Santa Clara County. Please welcome Ann Ravel.
Thank you.
And to her left, Allan Zaremberg, President and CEO of the California Chamber of Commerce, or Cal Chamber as it's known. He's held that position since 1998, and before that he served as a Chief Legislative Advisor and Advocate for Governors George Deukmejian and Pete Wilson. Please welcome Allan Zaremberg. So, and I should say we're going to save time at the end for your questions, so be thinking of what it is you'd like to ask. We'll have somebody roving around with a microphone, Phil Donahue style. Let me begin. The theme of this discussion is improving California's elections. So let me ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Allan. What needs improving?
Well, I think when we talk about campaign finance reform and money, as Eric pointed out, I think we need to step back a little bit, and we have to understand the major changes that happened in the last few years that first took place in California's legislative elections and in our statewide elections, where we have now an open primary and a top two runoff. And also we have a fair redistricting. We took redistricting out of the hands of the legislature where there was an inherent conflict, and that was Proposition 11. And then Prop 14, for the second time in the last couple decades, the people had a chance to vote for an open primary. The people voted for it originally in the 1990s, and the Supreme Court threw it out on a freedom of association on a very close vote. But what we have, and I think I need to explain the consequences of this, because I think it does lead into one of these compromises about where the trade-offs are between money and competition. So prior to a fair redistricting and prior to an open primary and a top two runoff, the lines were drawn by the legislature. They drew their own lines, and many seats were guaranteed Republican or Democrat. And now we have a little more competition because somebody else is drawing the lines. But more significantly, with the open primary and the top two runoff, the elections for most seats are no longer decided in the primary. Now, let me tell you, the parties hate this. The parties were the ones who got it thrown out in the 1990s because it created more competition. But for the people, I think it's good, and I think it's good for everybody. And let me explain to you what the difference is in terms of turnout. So in a primary election, maybe 25% of the voters turn out. We saw for the mayor's race in LA, we barely had 23%, 22%. In a general election, as a presidential year, and in November, you might get 75 to 80%. A governor's race, 65 to 70%. That's a heck of a lot more voters than in a primary where you have 25%. So if you have a safe Democrat seat, even with fair redistricting, Marin County's a safe Democrat seat, parts of Orange County are safe Republican seats. If the decision was going to be made in a primary and you had an open seat, maybe the people that decided that election were only the Democrats in Marin County that voted in the primary, and the Republicans didn't get a say, and whoever won that primary guaranteed to win November. The election was over with those few people making the decision. Well, now we're probably in Marin County going to have two Democrats run off. And you're going to have a situation where somewhere between 65 and 80% of the people are going to make the decision in Marin County on which Democrat meets the needs of all the voters. Democrats, but also declined estates, which is the most growing part of our demographic in terms of voters, and Republicans. And so we have a decision, we have an election that is made by 65 to 80% of the voters rather than 20 to 25% of the voters. I submit to you that that is the way democracy should work. Whether you agree with who wins or loses, the people should get a chance to vote. But what the consequence is, and what's going to bring to this discussion, I think, is that there is more competition. There's more races, and it's going to take more money. These are the trade-offs. Because when you have more competition and more runoffs and more trade-offs, more competition, and you go to more people to make the decision. So if you're in the primary, you only have to reach 22% of the voters. You know exactly who they are. It doesn't cost you a lot of money. But when you have to appeal to all the voters, 65 to 80% of them, and they're voters from all three, Republicans, declined estates, and Democrats, costs you a little more money. But I submit to you because we're going to talk about, is money corrupt? That's what it takes to communicate, and I submit to you that it's much better to be able to have everybody involved in the electoral process and make those decisions on who gets elected to our legislature.
So just quickly, though, coming back to the question, what needs improving, are you saying that those reforms were adequate and all is well, or are there things that could still be improved? And just briefly, and then we'll get to Ann.
I think the jury is still out on that. We only had one election. I explain this to you because when I speak, I explain it to the voters who may have experienced it in 2012. They weren't even sure of what they were doing. I think it's going to take a couple election cycles to see, because I think you're right. What are the problems? And the solution should meet the problems. And, and I think we talk about, you have to understand, I think, the background to understand when we talk about the problems with money in politics, are there problems? What are they? And we need resources to have more competitive elections. So I think that's first and foremost in these things. And I'll say, what is the problem? The problem is, I'll just say this, is what I think the people support, but the problem to me is that there are the campaign limits for candidates, we'll talk about are so restrictive that all the money is driven underground. We talked about Citizens United, but in California they were doing independent expenditures long before that, because the constraints on how much a candidate can raise are so limited, and the problem is the candidate doesn't run the race, and that's a problem.
And Ravel, from where you sit as chair of the FPPC, is money how is money a problem, or is it not? I mean, do you agree with what Allan's saying, is that really it's the limits themselves that have caused some of the problems?
I actually think that the major problem in campaigns in California, both at the local level and statewide, has to do with the large amount of money that is not disclosed. It's the independent expenditures that have, because it is true, we've had independent expenditures for some time in California, 10 years. And it was never a problem, or it was never a huge problem to get those have those independent expenditures. But what has happened, in particular since Citizens United, is that a lot of that money now, probably even in, not so much in California, but nationwide, at least a third to 40% of those independent expenditures are from sources that nobody knows who they are. And I believe, I mean, going back to your original question that you posed to Allan, that people really do care about who's behind campaigns. It makes a difference, and it makes a difference in whether people vote. And the whole purpose of campaign finance reform is to instill trust in government and to get people involved in the political system. And many people say that one of the reasons they don't participate in voting is because, number one, they don't feel that their vote will count, but also because they don't have information about the cues to tell them about how to vote.
But don't campaigns and candidates also, they need to spend money to educate people?
Absolutely.
California's a big state.
Absolutely, and I agree with Allan in that regard. I think that the problem is not money per se. It's, clearly people feel negatively about the fact that there is so much money in campaigns, but California is a big state. In order to get out your message, good, and many, that's true for many good candidates. I mean, they're good people who run, but they need money, and they need to be able to get those contributions.
After the 2010 governor's race, there were headlines that it was a record-breaking campaign in terms of expenditure, most expensive gubernatorial election in the country, in history. And I think Meg Whitman spent about $160 million, and Jerry Brown and Labor together spent another 60 or so. And there's a sense that money inherently is a sign of corruption or something being wrong with our process, with the system. What do you think about that, Allan?
Well, I'll come back to one of the points about Canada, and we'll discuss ballot measures too. I think is important to discuss. in congressional federal ads, when a candidate does an ad by themselves, they pay for it and they produce it. At the end of it or at the beginning, they say, "I approve this ad." But far too often, because the limits are so strict, especially in California, you don't have the resources to really run your own ads and say, I approve this ad. Even if that, and that's not the law in California, but if it were, you wouldn't have that. You would see the dearth of that because many of these are done by independent expenditures. And I think the more that the candidate is doing that ad, then you can trust that candidate. I mean, it's a reflection of the candidate. If they're running their own campaign, then that they're in particular, they decided to run this message, or they're going to stand on their record, or they're going to stand on their principles. But when somebody else does the ad for them, which it says, we talk about independent expenditures. They are independent legally of the candidate's campaign. Is that good or bad? Well, that's the way it is. I submit to you, it probably isn't all that good because you have a third party. I don't care who that third party is, telling you the message about what they think is good about that candidate, usually done on some research that they did with the voters, and it may or may not reflect the candidate. And if we could get to a situation where we had total transparency, immediate, where you didn't have limits like this, and the candidate did their own campaign, you'd better be able to evaluate the candidate when they run their own campaign. You'd be able to trust them, you'd know what their ethics were, and you'd also know exactly where all the money came from.
You think transparency alone is enough, just so that everyone knows where the money's coming from?
It may not be enough. I mean, one of the suggestions of what might make a difference is campaign public financing and public finance, but most people don't seem to want it. And it also has to be constrained because the Supreme Court has ruled unconstitutional certain kinds of campaign finance or public financing schemes. But I know New York is looking at a sort of financing scheme, public financing scheme that gives money if the candidate has raised a certain amount of small donations.
San Francisco
And San Francisco has done something.
And I mean, as always with any reform, there's unintended consequences to that as well.
There are.
Well,
San Francisco has had some unintended consequences.
I would, you asked, is money corrupt? And, money is corruptible, but it's the people. I mean, I think, the people who are our leaders, who are our political leaders, they're the ones who determine whether or not money corrupts them because it's necessary to communicate with people. I think the key for the voters is being able to cut through this and know exactly who you can trust and who isn't corrupted by money that takes to communicate with you. So I had a discussion, doesn't matter which party, an individual came in and said, well, they wanted to run for Secretary of State. And they had these platforms, and I said, well, have you done any voter research? And a Secretary of State's office to communicate with 16 million voters in a Secretary of State's office, there is no real constituent. It's not like the governor where people get bills signed or vetoed. The Secretary of State does election work, does ministerial work, does corporations, things like that it doesn't invite a lot of campaign contributions. So I asked this individual, said, well, I think this should be what the message is. And I said, I think your problem is that you're going to have to understand, you're going to have to know what the people think the Secretary of State does, because you determine how much money, and you can't raise a lot of money to run for Secretary of State. You're not going to tell the public what the Secretary of State should do. You're going to need to find out what the people think the Secretary of State should do already and how you fit into that category. Because we talk about money being corruptible. There just isn't enough money to communicate with the voters for that type of office. And that ironically and unfortunately is how people have to make their decisions based on who they trust, who their endorsements are, and what their policies are. But you're first going to say, what does the treasurer, should they do? What should the controller do? What the Secretary of State should do? And I guarantee you, most people don't have an astute knowledge of all of that, and you have to live with that.
The problem is, though, we're living in a world where the Supreme Court has said money given directly to candidates by people can be corruptible. It can be corruption if they receive large sums of money, and that's why they've approved expenditures and contributions that can be cut off at a certain level, as long as it's not unconstitutional, whereas independent expenditures are unlimited. And, which
So I think it's important to talk about, you know, what elections are important. So I brought up the Secretary of State just as an example of it's pretty darn hard for that office to communicate with voters. In a legislative election where one vote can make the difference in whether or not a tax measure passes or a new regulation passes or it doesn't pass, it may be the balance of power. We see where there's 40 senators or 80 assembly people, not one Secretary of State, where you have campaigns that spend $5 to $10 million. Well, you probably won't spend that on the Secretary of State's statewide campaign, but you'll have numerous elections where, I come back to, where it's one of those few very competitive seats that is going to switch the balance of power for certain issues. And that's important to certain people to come in and spend money on because there is a consequence to that election. And I think those become situations where we talked about, is it corruptible? Like I said, I don't think money is corrupt. I think it's the individual, and I think it's up to them to be able, and then the hard part for the voters is to determine, you know, who represents my community in those elections.
You talked about transparency, and you mentioned the Secretary of State's office, and she, of course, now it's a she, runs CalAccess, which is the central database for all the campaign contributions. It is very hard to use. It is very hard to search. It's not user-friendly. That seems like a really easy thing to fix. So, especially in, you know, here we are, Silicon Valley, the home of technology. Why hasn't such a basic thing that would improve transparency for everyone who wants it, why is that still a problem?
it is definitely a problem. I mean, the CalAccess system actually went down during a filing period, which was really problematic, and it is difficult for people, even astute people who understand campaign finance, to sort through the information to be able to get it and have it be usable.
You have to think that's deliberate.
We
have to wonder if it isn't deliberate anyway.
I would not dream of speaking about another constitutional officer, but it is a real serious problem, I think, for the state. And you're right, now that there is the ability to have open source coding, and you can provide a system where people would be able to access information and make connections that they want to make to look to see where people are getting their money. I think someone should be doing that.
Allan, you talked about the inherent conflict of politicians drawing political lines. Is there not also an inherent conflict, and I'm not sure what the solution would be, maybe appoint a citizens commission, but to fix problems like this? I mean, politicians don't look kindly generally at the FPPC, for example. It's not their best friend. I don't know how well funded your office is. I'm sure you could use more funding. So is that an inherent problem, that politicians are in charge, in a sense, of reform and, you know, transparency?
Well, I don't think politicians are in charge of Ann's agency. I can tell you that Ann's in charge of that. And, you know, I think she, frankly, because I've heard her speak before today, and you know, I certainly applaud her strategy that, you know, it's really about compliance. You know, punishment should be is there necessary to ensure compliance, but the more that her agency can do to help people comply with the law, the better off we all are. I mean, that's what the laws were created, and it should apply to all government agencies. The more that they can do to help everybody who is subject to their jurisdiction to comply with the law as it is, and help guide them and help do that. But this is a very complicated area, and maybe Ann can talk about it. It's very technical.
I think it's a common perception that the legislature doesn't want to fund the Secretary of State for transparency or the FPPC to actually enforce the laws that might impact them. But that has not been my experience. And actually, there was a bill that passed the legislature last year that has, relating to lobbying that has a fee that will go to improve the Cal Access system. So I think that the legislature, if they understand that the person who is in the office is going to be fair, I don't, and we have a number of bills now that we're sponsoring that have to do with greater disclosure and greater enforcement ability for the FPPC. And in order to amend the Political Reform Act, it requires a 2/3 vote, and it has to be a bipartisan vote because we didn't have a 2/3 of the legislature, and all of our bills passed out of the House of Origin this year.
Yeah, not to beat a dead horse here, but how much money would it take to fix Cal Access to make it more? I mean, it's sort of
Yeah.
I know you don't have a dollar figure, but I mean, how much could it be?
Well, I actually think the Secretary of State gave a figure, and she kept revising it when they were doing that particular piece of legislation. Personally, I think that it may still be a high figure. I mean, if there were some involvement of people in Silicon Valley, as you suggested, it would be possible to get it done less expensively.
Yeah. Last year, there was and Eric alluded to it, there was a very high-profile donation that came in from Arizona, $11 million for Prop 132, which was being fought by the unions, and against Prop 130, the governor's tax increase. You sued. The California Supreme Court, right before the election, forced some disclosure. What did you learn from that experience?
Well, I think what we learned from it is what is reflected in some of the legislation that we're sponsoring this year. Number one, that there was a lot of resistance to disclosure, and the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, decided on a Sunday afternoon before the election that they had to comply with an audit of the FPPC. So it's clear that we need greater ability to enforce our laws. So that's number one. Number two is it's very difficult. The donors, the contributors that they ultimately disclosed to us, one was a Virginia 501c6 that then sent money to an Arizona 501c4 that then gave money to the other Arizona 501c4 that then gave money to a super PAC in California.
Well thought out.
Yes, it was very well thought out. And I think that the difficulty of getting to the actual human contributors is shown by the fact that this is the way that major contributions are being made now. And so that is something that requires much greater legislative enactments to help us get to them.
And how hampered are you by federal law?
Well, I don't actually think we're hampered by federal law because if there is a contribution that is intended for a campaign in California, it needs to be disclosed. We have authority over any campaigns, whether expenditures or contributions in California.
Yeah. Allan, the organizations making that contribution, that particular contribution, have the same positions on Prop 132 and Prop 130 as the Chamber, correct? I believe that's
No, as a matter of
were you
fact,
neutral on Prop 130?
we did not position on either one.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. So what was going through your mind as you watched that unfold?
Well, I think what went through my mind is what goes through my mind when we do normal campaigns for initiatives. And I think this is one of the first times that we have seen, maybe to me, the only time where people, corporations, unions, whoever they were that contributed to these, went to these kinds of lengths to do this. Prior to this situation, initiative campaigns have had full disclosure. We've never had this type of situation. We've never seen it before. And so I know there are always companies that may feel, so the initiative about genetically engineered foods that was on the ballot recently, and that was defeated, and there was a significant amount of money spent on both sides. This notion that who is the money behind a particular initiative, yes or no, I don't think ever matters as much as candidate campaigns may be different. But I think for initiatives, it doesn't matter as much as the facts of what the initiatives are. And I think in most initiatives, the public is well informed and pretty much makes the right decision and never holds it against a company, a business, an individual for defending themselves, defending their business, defending themselves. It's more actually the initiative. So I can recall one initiative, frankly, that I do think people, and we didn't oppose this either for political reasons, so I'll express a little culpability here, but the Senate and Assembly and Republican Democrat leadership had their own campaign finance reform a number of years ago to stave off a court decision that was coming down the pike upholding a more stringent campaign finance reform. And I think that basically the attitude was, well, this is better than what the judge is going to rule on. And it actually wasn't. I mean, notwithstanding the fact that, like I said, I think these drive campaign contributions underground, which I think is horrible. Frankly, it's not good. But that was one rare situation, I think. I think the public reads ballot arguments. I think the people that consistently vote listen carefully. They read things. And I think for the most part, people understand what the initiatives are and where the money comes from, which is kind of the interesting part about Prop 30 and 32. Rarely have I ever seen people make a decision for initiatives. Like I said, candidates are a little different. For initiatives on where the resources come from, because you have the ability to defend yourself, and I don't think the public holds that against you.
Jan, what do you think?
I totally disagree.
Okay.
That's the one place I have to say I disagree with you. First off, I think most initiatives are very complicated, and it's difficult for most people, even lawyers, who understand how to read that legalese, to comprehend what the issues are with the amount of detail that's necessary in order to make a thoughtful vote. I mean, basically, people are sitting as legislator for the day. And most legislators, when they look at bills, have lots of staff and lots of hearings and lots of information about it, and the public doesn't have that. And it's been shown that a lot of people, how they vote on initiatives is through voting queues, through shortcut information that will allow them to vote consistently with their views. And a really good example of this from the 2010 election was an initiative that was brought to you by a committee that was called something like, taxpayer. It was like Americans for Responsible Leadership, but it was something like Good Citizens for Fair Taxes or something like that. And if it had not, it was about requiring a supermajority vote in a local community if that community wanted to establish its own power. And what that initiative was actually totally sponsored by PG&E. And if it had not been for the disclosure that was required in California law, nobody would have known that. And that made a huge difference in that election. It made a huge difference.
Was that on the ballot after the San Bruno?
No,
It was before.
it was before. It was in 2010 in the June, in the primary. So those kinds of cues, that kind of information, particularly about initiatives. I mean, it used to be for candidates, it was what party, and that still has some validity even with the top two primary, but that's a voting queue. And those are the kinds of things that have people making decisions about how to vote, even though they don't know a lot about somebody's background.
And I think, Ann, you thought that that initiative shouldn't have been on the ballot, and the public voted it down.
No, I didn't think one way or
Oh,
the
you-
other.
well-
I just think that the disclosure
Yes.
is what's important, because that's what permits people
People to
to
make decisions,
understand
yes.
and make a decision, even though if they had read that and thought, oh, 2/3 vote, that sounds like a really good idea, why not?
Yeah. We haven't talked much about some of these, like the ballot measure committees that elected officials have, the Latino caucus and the other interest groups that have caucuses where the limits don't apply. The FBI, well, let's not go there. But there have been some inquiries at the Capitol lately that will continue to come out as that unfolds. But where are we not looking that we should be looking when it comes to limits on contributions?
We have, lobbyists are not permitted to contribute to campaigns in California on the state level. We have pretty stringent rules that relate to campaign contributions, and in particular the contributions that are given to candidates specifically. So, from that perspective, I do agree with Allan, which is that we at the FPPC have such great ability to see who's contributing, where the money's going, where they're spending, all of those things with respect to lobbying as well as with regard to candidates. And so it's sort of an anomaly that we don't have that information for those independent expenditure committees.
What would it take? Go ahead, Allan. Yeah.
Well, I think, where Ann disagreed with me, and I appreciate that on initiatives, I do think that where the money comes from can make a difference on independent expenditures for candidates. We've seen that, whether if one company gave all the money to one candidate, that would make a difference. And but we just saw it in the mayor's race in Los Angeles, where a huge independent expenditure on behalf of one of the unions. I think both candidates had union support, but one particular had an excess of over all the other ones, and I think that was used against one of the candidates. So I do think, certainly in Canada elections, it can make a difference.
And that's one issue that he raises that I think it's important to remember. There are independent expenditures in local campaigns, lots of independent expenditures that have a huge impact, and some of them that come from outside the local area. In LA, over a third of the money that went into that campaign was independent expenditure money. And people are surprised about this. There's independent expenditures in judicial races. So there are people who the judge in the judge's campaign can't respond to because they are bound by rules of conduct, but there are independent expenditures.
Yeah.
So those are things that I think are really having an impact on our system of voting.
Yeah, Allan, you said earlier that you didn't think that money really influenced, I'm paraphrasing, it didn't really influence the way elected officials voted, but that it gave them access. You really believe that's true?
I don't think I said that. I think we had this discussion earlier.
All right,
but,
maybe that was in the other room.
and I think I think you should ask Ann that question. I don't think, I think it's the individual. And for the most part, I think we have exceptions of, certainly we've seen in local communities down in Southern California where, there have been law enforcement actions against people who, when they run their city or their city government, have been prosecuted. I think for the most part, people understand that, and is it because somebody's watching over them like Ann or, somebody else? I happened to be in George Deukmejian's office when they had the shrimp scam, FBI sting. And so I think there are, people know that people are watching. But I'll come back to, it's like anything. I don't care what business you're in, what not-for-profit, whatever you do, it's about the people. And, what we need to strive to do is find the best people and make sure that there's a chance for the voters, whoever they are and wherever they are, to know that candidate better and be able to make an informed choice, and that most of the voters, and I'll get my pitch in here on Los Angeles, we're only 22% vote for the mayor's race in the second largest city in America, as opposed to in November, just 5 months earlier, 75% of the people turned out for the presidential election. Why didn't they have it then?
Yeah.
So you can ask Ann that.
Yeah. And I want to give you folks a chance to ask some questions as well. So if you have something you want to ask or say, put your hands up. We've got some microphones in the back. But let me give you a chance to respond to that. The question of access versus influence and all that.
Well, I'm basing my response on what I've read, and I've read some studies that have been done, social science studies recently, that have shown that campaign contributions per se prior to a vote or in relationship to a vote are not the sole reason why somebody votes the way they do. That if you account for party, other associations, relationships, and the like, it is not possible to just isolate out a campaign contribution as a reason for somebody to have voted in a particular way. And I, on this, agree with Allan. I mean, I think that first off, in California, despite the fact that there have been FBI and all of those things, we don't know why, at the Capitol, for the most part, most legislators, most local officials, they really are trying to do a good job, and the number of actual enforcement actions that result in any problems is pretty small. I mean, so I would say on the whole, corruption is not an issue in California politics on the whole. And I just think that the issue does have to do more with access, more with relationships than money per se.
Yeah. Let's take some audience questions.
My name is Sanda Everett, and I'm from the Green Party of California. And I feel like I was already disenfranchised in Marin County because he assumed there's only Democrats, Republicans, and declined to stay, while Marin County has a majority city council in Fairfax, among other places. And I'm really concerned that the top two primary is going to totally eliminate alternative voices, and whereas most countries around the world have proportional representation, have a multi-party system, and I feel like California needs to have the opportunity to have more voices for more people. And I guess I don't know what my question is in there, but
would anybody dispute that the top two has really diminished the influence, the opportunities that smaller parties have?
I don't think we know yet. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't think we know yet. And we've had one experience at this and one shot at it, and I honestly don't think we know what the consequences are of the top two, and whether we'll see a lot of benefit from it, or as the spokesperson here said, that she thinks it's in certain parts not good. So I think we'll know more after a couple election cycles.
It is hard to imagine, though, in the vast majority of elections, thinking that you're going to have a Green Party or one of the other minority parties, independent parties, against a Democrat or a Republican, isn't it?
And I appreciate what you say about your community, and I think, as I said originally, I think there are trade-offs in the political process, and I think, more people voting and more competition leads to the cost of more money, and I hope in your situation, if you have a viable candidate, that it makes the top two, which they might not have been able to do in a primary election. So, but remains to be seen, I think.
And anything to add? Yeah. Let's go in the back. Is there anybody in the back? Yes, this gentleman right back here.
Thank you. My name is Steve Chesson. I'm president of Californians for Electoral Reform. And I wasn't expecting this. My question is sort of a follow-up on the previous one. H.L. Mencken once said that for every complex problem, there's a solution that's simple, neat, and wrong. And our organization views the top two primary as the wrong solution to the very complex problem of representation. If you look at most of Western Europe and most of the emerging democracies that came out of the breakup of the former Soviet Union, they all went to proportional representation. So I guess my question is how long are you going to give the current system that we have now before you decide that, well, nothing has really changed. We're still going to have gridlock in Sacramento unless one of the parties gets 2/3 in both houses. How long is it going to take before the good government groups are going to be willing to look at reforms like proportional representation?
Maybe might be asking the wrong people.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's, I'll just we'll use Prop 11 as an example where we talked about how complicated some initiatives are. And I think
the redistricting?
The redistricting. Yeah. And most people, I think, when they're very complicated, the public tends to vote no if it's too complicated for them to understand. Proposition 11, whether you agree with it or you disagree with it, that's the Citizens Commission on Redistricting. The legislature was never going to do it on their own. They were never going to take from their own authority the ability to draw the lines. And we see this in many city councils and counties where there's an inherent conflict between who draws the lines. So that to me is the perfect example of why we have a citizen's right to put initiatives on the ballot in California. And I think the people would agree with that. I'm sorry that doesn't answer your question. No, it doesn't, but I don't, yes.
Bill, yeah, real quickly.
Let me stand up if I can. I don't need this thing, but I'll check it. First of all, Allan, thanks for the nod to the open primary. Just a little background. Leon Panetta, as chairman, and I, as ostensible president, 2004, put it on a ballot. The legislature got together and beat it. The survivable and solvable issue is getting rid of the gridlock. And the only way we're going to do that now, and quickly, we'll debate finance for the next 50 years, but with the open primary, we enfranchise the declined estate voters in the primary, and we enfranchise everybody. In San Francisco, 9% of the registration are Republicans, assuming there are a number of those who are not absolutely extreme, idiotic ideologues, and there are a few of them. They can vote for the more moderate Democrat in the San Francisco primary. And the almost 30% declined estate, no party preference voters can vote in the primary. We've enfranchised all those people.
Let me ask if you could just frame it into a question.
And the question is, how do we educate the voters over the next 3 or 4 election cycles on how to beneficially use that process? And one more sentence. And the decline of collegiality started with the FPPC. People that play together stay together. You can't buy anybody a dinner anymore. We used to know everybody. Nobody gets together today. Then next.
All right, no, that was your one extra sentence. So, do you feel that people understand the top two primary? I mean, it seems like certainly the parties do, and the candidates do. I mean, we've already seen one incumbent long-time congressman get knocked off. Another one is being challenged down in the South Bay. Is that the way you envisioned it happening?
Well, two things. First of all, I think some of these people who lost in Congress, the districts weren't the same. So that was the result of a citizens commission where Congress worked with the legislature to protect the incumbents. And that changed. And so you had some incumbents long-term who no longer represented a community and were, and lost. I think in terms of, do I feel like, as Bill said, I don't think we know yet. I think it's an education process. I think when I talk to voters about this, and some understand it, but not everybody understands, the difference between selecting in a primary versus selecting in a general election where more people get to vote. And I think the more we do it, notwithstanding, and I appreciate very much the lady's comment here, that if the more we can get people engaged in, as Anne laments, whatever is causing people to be turned off, to be involved, to understand the three branches of government, to understand, regardless of, I think we're unique in the world. I mean, other people say, well, in these countries they do this. We have a government to me, and that's why I'm here. Why do I care about elections? Why do I care about this? Promotes innovation, promotes entrepreneurship, and you see it in San Francisco, in the Bay Area counties, and I think it's because we have a governmental system that promotes the ability to take risk, that government isn't going to interfere in that, and we see a difference in entrepreneurship and innovation that I don't think exists throughout the world. And it's here, and I think it's a lot because of our government, the way it's set up, and I think the more we can get people to participate in that, I think we will all be better off for that.
Okay. Another couple of audience questions. Yeah, back here.
Hi. Hi. So, Allan, you spoke about how increasing money might improve a candidate's access to citizens. Did I get that correct?
To being able to have the ability to communicate with the voters. It takes resources, yes.
Got it. So, sort of thinking, and I've worked for candidates and I've worked for campaigns before, when you increase the amount of money, you also increase donors' access to candidates. Are you worried at all that donors' access to candidates is increasing beyond what citizens are getting, even as you're increasing the candidates' access to citizens? Does that make sense?
Well, I think so. Well, and maybe I can understand your question. I think, once again, there's trade-offs. And if you have more competitive elections, it takes more money, and therefore you're going to have more donors or larger donors, and is that a problem? I think that's the way I interpreted your question to some extent. And, I think it's important, once again, for the voters to get to know their candidates, to try to be involved in the process and not be turned off by what you just said, because it takes money to communicate. Does it take, in an assembly race, $10 million to communicate? You get sick of seeing these mailers over and every day, and I think that turns people off, and you can overspend. So to your point, I think you can overspend in certain city council races. It's and we saw this in the mayor's race in Los Angeles to some extent. So there is a diminishing return on how much money you spend, and I think that can hurt a candidate. Maybe Ann can speak to that better than I can. I know.
I think it's a circular problem, and at bottom line, for me, the thing that is going to solve some of this problem is to get more people interested in the political system. I think it's really unfortunate how few people are involved and how few people vote, and there needs to be greater access and involvement in voting. And so those groups that are working with, the minority community, with other communities to increase voter participation, personally, I think that's the real answer to this issue, ultimately.
All right, I'm told we have time for one more question. How about right here? Oh, where are you going with the microphone?
My name's Karush Benham. One question that I had was, most of these independent institutions that are spending most of the money in campaign finance, they come mostly from elite individuals, not from the common people like us. So back to one, you were talking about, what's another solution? Is there a way we can maybe cap these elite individuals? Is there a way we could do that?
The Supreme Court has ruled that for independent expenditures, it's unlimited. and so there is no ability to cap because the view is that it's not corrupting.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Allan Zaremberg
you.
and Ann Ravel. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Scott, I want to thank you for doing a wonderful job of moderating a conversation that really has surfaced so many interesting and complex issues about our election system in California. And Ann, I want to thank you for being part of this conversation and for your leadership of the FPPC. And Allan, thank you very much. Very illuminating conversations. And I want to thank you also for your leadership of the business community in California, which has been very, very important. Eric, as usual, you set the table very nicely in terms of the conversations. And what a series of interesting conversations came about, not just from the panel today, but from the questions that the audience posed. So I'm looking forward to meeting some of you in the audience and continuing the conversation amongst ourselves here in the reception that is about to follow. Once again, this wouldn't have been possible without the generosity of our speaker series sponsors as well as the donor circle. So we thank you for your support today. We want to also thank everyone in the audience for taking the time out of your busy lives to come to PPIC and to help us think about what needs to be done for a better future for California. Before you leave, please fill out the PPIC's evaluation survey. And I do really hope that you all have a chance to come and join us in the reception that will follow and continue the conversation. So thanks very much for being here today.